Okay, so I have 2 minutes after our planned start time. So we'll get this going. I'm Marty Rosendale. I'm the CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. And this is the live Capital M Zoomcast. The Capital M podcast was originally created to further the regional conversation around access to capital and capital markets. But today we're also talking quite a bit, as you can imagine, about the COVID-19 pandemic. Our Zoomcast today is sponsored by Alexandria Real Estate and Pfizer. So those of you that may not be familiar with the Maryland Tech Council, we are the industry trade association that represents both technology and life science companies throughout the state. Fundamentally, our mission is to help our members and those industries succeed. And one last thing before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphones are on mute right now. I will be monitoring both the chat room and the Q&A during our discussion today. So if you have a comment or you would like to ask a question, we ask that you use one of those two features. You should be able to find both of them at the bottom of your screen. And our Zoomcast is being recorded, so if you know anybody that would like to watch it or listen to it after the fact, you'll be able to find it at our website at the Maryland Tech Council website, mdtechcouncil.com. So my guest today is Dr. Karen Smith. Dr. Smith is the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Emergent BioSolutions. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're very busy these days.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me along today. It's a great honor for me to be able to represent Emergent BioSolutions. And we have over 2,200 colleagues across the globe, so I would be remiss if I didn't give them a little bit of a shout out and my sincere thanks for everything they do in pursuit of our mission, because it really is very much aligned to where we are today with COVID. So, and also thank you to the sponsors and all the listeners.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know Emergent is really in the middle of all this and the response to COVID. So, Dr. Smith, Emergent BioSolutions has been a long-time supporter of biotechnology in this region and the Maryland Tech Council for that matter. You're a thought leader in life sciences. You recently joined Emergent. Can you just take a couple of minutes, tell us about yourself, tell us about Emergent BioSolutions.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. So I joined Emergent earlier this year just as COVID was really being declared a public health emergency. And I felt that my background as a clinician scientist and somebody who's been closely involved in bringing over 20 drugs to market over the past 20 years could perhaps be helpful. And I also really wanted to contribute to the pandemic solutions. And what better way to do that than to join with Emergent, and it's a company that has been addressing public health threats for 22 years. We have a fairly diverse operation. We have a contract development and manufacturing organization, or a CDMO. It serves the needs of both pharmaceutical and biotech innovators in every stage of drug development. We're also a long-standing partner to the US and allied governments in providing preparedness and response solutions that meet their needs for national security, including the chemical and biological threats like anthrax, smallpox, etc. A lot of infectious diseases work like influenza, Lassa fever. We also have our own R&D and commercial expertise in various areas, including travel health and opioid emergencies and monoclonal antibodies and polyclonals. And so we're certainly doing our own work as well in terms of therapies and thinking through how we can also contribute to COVID. So overall, a really well-rounded company, certainly well-positioned to help here. And, and it's in Maryland. What's not to love about that?
That's true. That's true. I know when Emergent built out the manufacturing, the excess manufacturing capacity in Baltimore, I don't think anybody anticipated that we would be putting it to use so soon. But we're all very grateful that it's there. That's for certain. So I realize that you can't comment on anything specific related to the work that Emergent is doing or any clients of the company. But recently, or actually this morning, I saw a newsletter from Bio, and in that newsletter they referenced a time clock. And the time clock, they said if midnight were the start of the pandemic and noon were some back to normal, whatever normal's going to look like, then we're at about 8 a.m. Now, given your involvement in the international response, can you talk to us a little bit about what does that international response look like? Where is it at, and what can we expect?
So, if we're at 8 a.m., then I regard that as a good sign from Bio. And it's hard to really determine where we are on that time clock without actually knowing what the finishing line is. And, I've talked with many groups around different aspects of how we're approaching this, about the vaccines, about the FDA requirement for 50% effectiveness, and what does that really mean, and what does that look like, and is that enough? When you talk about herd immunity, when the pandemic first hit, people talked about, oh, we need to reach herd immunity in the community, and what is that? That's sort of 60 to 70% are immune, so which is higher than the effectiveness being required of the vaccines. So I think really understanding what the finishing line looks like, and I also think that it's probably not going to be a defined line that we step across and everybody says, okay, we're here. I think it is something that for some time we will continue to manage through, but I think the tools that we will have to do that will have increased over time. And I think what this has really done and shown us is it's really pushed many groups across government and industry into action. It's required an enormous amount of collaboration at different levels across, again, government, public, private partnerships. And in a way, it has taken people who traditionally might have been competitors, such as pharmaceutical companies, and it's really asked them to work together towards the development of preventative and therapeutic interventions. As a result of that, we now have this enormously crowded pipeline of therapies and vaccines and novel drugs and repurposed drugs, and it's growing exponentially in terms of how we're approaching this. And one of the interesting data points is the sheer number. The pipeline drugs at the moment are 1,316 as of, I think, yesterday. Wow. And that's novel agents and repurposed. But can you imagine the number of options that we're looking at for this disease? And then you translate that down a step again and say, well, okay, for all of these things that we're looking at, we have to now test them and put them into a clinical trial in some way, shape, or form. So there are currently 3,453 clinical trials. So, on the one hand, you can say, wow, it's great that we have so many shots on goal. But the flip side of that is that, we really need to be thoughtful about how we're utilizing our resources. Could we collaborate more? Could we collapse some of those trials? Could we perhaps look at how we're leveraging people and resources and patients and, subjects enrolling for those trials? And so it is something that we need to wrestle with. I think it's wonderful that globally everybody has stepped up to the plate. I don't think there's a country that hasn't really tried to manage it, contain it, help treat it, certainly address the problem at hand. And perhaps if we'd have held hands a little more, a little earlier, then we might have a way forward that it has more collaborative feel to it. But I do think that collaboration has been outstanding in how we've approached this.
And I agree. The collaboration has been amazing. A year ago, if anybody would have asked me, how long does it take to bring a new vaccine to market, I would have said it takes 10 years and $1 billion to make it happen. Now, today, we're looking at something far different from that, right? We're looking at less than a year, still maybe $1 billion, given the money that the government's putting into it and whatnot. But the time to market is much, much faster. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. 1.5 billion is the price tag, 10 years is the timeline. And that's been a sort of a standard rhetoric that we've heard for decades now. So how is it that we have, over the course of a year, managed to shorten that by so much? And what is the trade-off? And what are the trade-offs that we have made and perhaps will continue to make there? So if you put aside the financial aspect of it, because at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much cheaper it's going to be ultimately, but the main reason that they've been able to shorten timelines is by doing things, rather than doing things sequentially, they're doing things in parallel or they're overlapping. So they've had a phase 1 trial that rolls into a phase 2 trial that rolls into a phase 3 trial, as opposed to do the phase 1, get the data, examine the data, make decisions about how you design your phase 2, kick off the phase 2, and so on. And so that sequential approach, first of all, it gives you time to digest the information that you have, to make good decisions about the next phase, to be thoughtful around how we're designing it. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? Do I need to change the dosing? Do I need to change the trial population? Does it work differently in different people? These are all sorts of things that you can look at. But if you're going to do significant overlap or roll one into the other, then you need to take some risks along the way. And certainly that's what we've ended up having to do. So, we've also relied on smaller data sets. So previously we needed larger data sets in order to make those decisions. And I think this plays into as people are thinking about things like the EUA, so the Emergency Use Authorization. And so how are we thinking about that, and how are the companies that are, perhaps towards the front of the leaderboard, how are they thinking about that? And, I think there's a couple of things that float to the top. And I think there are three things. One is that efficacy alone is not enough. It needs to be efficacious for sure, but that alone would not stand on its own for an EUA. Secondly, the manufacturing data. So you have to demonstrate safety and efficacy as part of the clinical trial, but when you manufacture, you have to manufacture in a way that demonstrates quality and consistency of the vaccine. And I think people sometimes lose sight about that because everything we hear is about safety and efficacy. But the third step in that, and a very important one, is how do we maintain the quality and consistency around that? And then, of course, the evidence, the clinical evidence that this vaccine, or the vaccines, because I do think we'll end up with more than one, are going to be safe. And when I think about safety, I also think about what's been in the news lately. And certainly what we've seen a lot in the news is the FDA coming out and saying we need 2 months of safety data on around half of the trial participants. And if you think about the size of these trials, so they do vary in size. They started off at 30,000. Some of the companies increased that to 44 or 60,000. Some of that was around providing greater inclusion and diversity in the trials. And so they wanted to expand the numbers so that they could have a greater cross-representation of subjects and patients and minority groups and ages and other aspects of looking at that. And so what the FDA has said at the end of the day is if you start off with a 30,000 person trial, which is where they started, most of these are one-to-one randomization with placebo. So I've got 30,000 people, you randomize one-to-one, which means I've now got 15,000 in placebo and 15,000 in the active arm or the vaccine arm. And so what I'm looking at is that 2 months follow-up after they have received the second dose. Let's also remember that the majority of these treatments and vaccines have a 2-dose approach, 21, 28 days, somewhere in there apart. So I need to dose, second dose, wait 2 months for my follow-up data, and then use that for my safety. And just to give you a comparator, the FDA would normally require the generation of 6 months safety data in order to have something that would be put forward for a submission. Time is of the essence, and these are some of the things that have enabled us to shorten timelines. And I don't think that moving forward outside of a pandemic situation, the FDA would be willing perhaps to be as flexible as they are being. But they are also saying, and quite rightly so, that that's not the end of the trial. So getting EUA, you still need to continue to dose, you still need to continue to follow people up, you still need to track for safety events. And so you still ultimately will need to apply for a full approval once you have sufficient sized databases for safety and efficacy and so on. So all of that data will continue to come in, but I think this is around how do we expedite, how do we collaborate? I think the FDA have done a wonderful job of really being close to the companies, being close to the innovators and the sponsors, having the conversations so that together we could work through what this is going to look like and what is the best approach and where are we willing to accept a little bit more risk. Where are we willing to accept, smaller data set than perhaps would traditionally be required. And so I think it's because everybody's been doing that and pushing towards the same thing that we've been, allowed to expedite the timeline. I think the follow-on question to that is that even when you get it across the line and when your clock reaches lunchtime and everybody feels as though we are perhaps over the hump, then who's going to take the vaccine? And certainly there's a lot of data points and a lot of conversations out there around that very topic. And I think the most recent poll that I saw had responses that only around 51% of the US population would get the vaccine even if it was free. So this is not a cost consideration. This is a would I or wouldn't I do it. And that's actually down from back in, I think the last poll I took was back in May. And at the time in May, it was 72%. So we've declined from sort of 3/4 of the population saying, yes, I would line up and take a vaccine, to only half of the population. And so we come back to the start of the question around that ticking clock and when do we get to the other side? And if we've got a vaccine that is 50% effective and only 50% of the population are willing to take it, then where does that leave us? And where is that line in the sand at which time we'll say we've crossed over this hurdle and we're now on the other side and have managed to live into a new normal, which I think is where most people think we'll end up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think more people need to hear from the clinicians and the scientists like yourself about the safety of the vaccine, because I think that's where the concern is coming from, and why that number of how many people would actually take the vaccine has dropped to 51%. I think more people need to hear what you just said, which is we're not taking any safety shortcuts. We're expediting, we're collaborating. I know, for instance, the companies are manufacturing at risk. And that's taking a big risk, because they don't know for sure if their product is going to get to market. And so these are the kinds of things that are happening to expedite it. And these are also things, one of the questions I get asked is, will this stick? Is the new norm now going to be we can get drugs and vaccines to the market within 2 years? And I tell people, there are business and financial risks being taken here that won't be taken, and they're, as you pointed out, not taking the pause between clinical trials to assess the trial. And so maybe we've learned some things that can shorten the timeline a bit in the future, but I don't think it's anything that's going to stick in the long term. But Dr. Smith, we did get one question that I think is related to this topic, and it has to do with countries like Australia that have significant clinical trial capability and capacity. Is there a way to accelerate the speed to market, maybe even do even more if there were more collaboration than there already is?
So Australia, a place that's near and dear to my heart, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm Australian. So, and Australia is an interesting one. And just on the topic we were just talking about in terms of would you get vaccinated or not? So, here's an interesting segue into that. So Scott Morrison, who's the Prime Minister of Australia, at some point came out and said, you know what, we're going to do mandatory vaccination for everybody. And it was an interesting point of view and an interesting approach to take. That was, Australia is an island, and so when the pandemic hit, they closed all of their borders. You couldn't fly between states without the two-week quarantine. At some point, they also said you're not flying at all. At the moment, they have a flight to the US that you can't take, so you can't fly in and out without an exception. So, and much like New Zealand, because they are an isolated island, they've done a lot to really close the borders and try and contain as much as they can. So it was interesting when Scott Morrison came out and said, okay, we're going to do mandatory vaccination. And then there was such a public outcry. He came back and sort of stepped back and wound that a little bit and said, look, we'll let the scientists decide and we'll have another dialogue about it in due course. So he's distanced a little bit from that very hardline approach. But in terms of, could we do more clinical trials? We do clinical trials in Australia all the time. So in fact, it's a great place to run clinical trials. They have really good facilities. They have great clinicians, physicians, scientists. They have very good phase 1 units in Australia. They have a population that is willing and able to partake in the clinical trials. They have good data collection. It's very robust in terms of the quality of the data that comes out of these clinical programs. So we do leverage Australia and many other countries around the world to run the clinical trials. And the only way you can run a 30,000, 60,000 person clinical trial, and remember, this isn't just one clinical trial. You have between 8 and 11, depending on how you count the numbers, phase 3 clinical trials ongoing at the moment. And if they all have, between 30 and 50,000 people even in them, that's a lot of patients. You aren't going to get that many subjects just in one country. And so it does have to be spread out across the world. And so we are using, Canada and Australia and Europe and many other places in order to run the trials. But Australia is certainly somewhere for decades now. We've placed clinical trials in the past. It's a really good location.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, Dr. Smith, a minute ago, when you were talking about clinical trials, you mentioned the population representation in the clinical trials. And one of the things that we've heard is that minorities are being affected by COVID-19 more than non-minorities. And this is also coming at a time when the national discussion around diversity, inclusivity, and equity has been escalated pretty dramatically. Can you talk a little bit about that? First of all, the misrepresentation or the fact that minorities are affected more by the virus, but then secondly, getting clinical trials to be representative of the population. Is this a new problem? Is this a problem, an issue that's been a challenge consistently? And how are we addressing it today?
I would say it's been underrepresentation, I think, has been a consistent problem for some time. However, how we have chosen to focus on it and try and change that, I think is more of a focus today than perhaps it has been in the past, for many reasons. And I think I would start with gaps in expectations. And so all of us want to return to this pre-pandemic lifestyle. But in order to get there, we need the effective therapies and vaccines. And I think at the moment, there's a significant gap between public expectations of what is going to be delivered for that, 10-year, $1.5 billion number, what is actually going to be available. This is the reality of what's coming through with testing and developing and going through regulatory and manufacturing and distribution and dosing and all of these sorts of things. So for example, it's only in more recent times that in the news, people have been talking about, oh, and you do realize this is 2 doses, and you do realize this is an intramuscular injection, and how do I track the 2 doses? And it will come with side effects and adverse events, because that's what comes with any drug or therapeutic or vaccine. People do have flu-type symptoms and muscle aches and pains and headache and all of these things. And there isn't 100% guarantee. You don't get the vaccine and go, okay, I'm, all bubble wrapped now and everything's going to be fine. It doesn't necessarily, if you're in the 50% cohort, there's 50% that have effectiveness, but the 50% that could still be infected, well, then does that mean I'm still going to be at the same level of risk? Or does this mean that perhaps I'll have a disease with reduced severity? Much like oftentimes with the flu vaccine, there are patients who won't get the flu and there are patients who will still get the flu, but it won't be as severe. So I think there's a lot of information that needs to be, and education that needs to happen around this. And I think this then flows on to the piece around disproportionate impact on minorities. We know from the data and the statistics that minority groups have a higher case rate, so greater prevalence, and we also know they have a higher death rate. So when you think about that, that's sort of the double whammy that happens. And you start to overlay things like, we see a higher proportion of minorities who are in the essential worker population, if you will. And we know that essential workers are in the higher risk category. We know that these individuals also have a higher prevalence of underlying health conditions, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, chronic lung disease, kidney disease, all of these things that we know when you have these underlying diseases, then it can play out in terms of more severe disease and poorer outcome for these individuals. So when we think about clinical trial design, you originally design a clinical trial and you design it and power it to reach a statistical endpoint, which is how they originally ended up with, the number that you need, 30,000, 40,000, 60,000, whatever the number is. And it's around a statistical endpoint rather than perhaps recruiting those people who are most impacted by the disease at question. So if I think about if I'm running an oncology trial, for example, I'm going to recruit people who have that particular type of cancer. If I'm running this trial, they started off just designing it to recruit subjects. I just need people to come into the trial to test this. But what we perhaps lost sight of, and many companies have now tried to address this, is when you think about census data, 18.5% of the US population is Latino, about 13.5% are Black. Are those numbers represented in the clinical trials? No, they are not. And so when we started pointing this out and saying, you know what, within the cohort of subjects you have in your clinical trial, you aren't necessarily really focused on those people who are being disproportionately impacted, who are disproportionately being infected, who are disproportionately having severe outcomes, who are disproportionately in the higher death rate. And so why wouldn't we want to make sure we have good representative numbers of these individuals? So that's the first piece, is understanding, wow, there's a mismatch in terms of the population that is being affected and impacted, and then how our clinical trials are designed and how they're recruiting. The other piece of this is the age range. So a lot of these trials started off in the phase 1, phase 2, 18 to 55-ish range. And then when we moved to phase 2, we sort of went 18 to 60, 65. But again, disproportionately impacted at those higher ages. So why wouldn't we want to include those in the clinical trial to understand, is there a difference in response? And the other thing to consider as well is that different vaccines may be better for different populations. We may find that one of these vaccines works better in older people. We may find that one of them works better in minority or Black populations. I don't know how this is going to play out, but unless we collect that data, unless we have those subjects in our trials, then we don't know. So the first piece of this is understanding diversity, inclusion, equity, clinical trials. How do I ensure I have representation so that as we roll these vaccines and therapies out, then we can predict the response that we're going to get from the different subjects and different individuals. So that's sort of one piece of it. The second piece of it is then how do I recruit and enroll people? Because what we also found is that education awareness concerns. I mean, certainly there is a history around running clinical trials and perhaps doing them in an unethical way on some subpopulations that has led to degrees of distrust, mistrust, concern, very valid concerns. And so there are certain cohorts and populations and ethnicities who do not want to enroll in a clinical trial. So really trying to match burden of disease with minority groups, addressing their health issues and concerns, providing the diversity in the clinical trials that goes beyond race and ethnicity, but also looks at things like age and gender and other aspects, and also underlying disease. If we always design the perfect trial for the perfect patient, and we rule out by virtue of the inclusion exclusion criteria that goes with a clinical trial, people who have complex clinical histories, underlying conditions, concomitant illnesses, all of these things are very common exclusions in a clinical trial. Well, then how do I know how this is going to play out when I roll it into what's called a real world setting, meaning outside of the perfect confines and guardrails that comes with a clinical trial? When I roll it out into a population, being able to predict and know how this is going to land is super important. So there's some of the thoughts that companies have taken on board, and a number of companies, Pfizer, Moderna, a lot of the lead companies have really come out and said, we are focused on enrolling minority groups. We are looking at target numbers of subjects so that we can actually have cohorts of data that we can draw conclusions from. Moderna actually slowed down their enrollment to enable more people to come in, representative of those minority groups, representative of those people who are disproportionately impacted. And a number of the other companies as well, AZ, J&J, and so on, have all come out and said, we do want representative people. We have, really looked at our inclusion exclusion. We are looking at how we're recruiting, how we're educating, what the awareness campaign is, how we're enrolling subjects, and so on. So I think that it is something, you raise a really good point. It is something that has been around for a number of years. And in fact, in 2018 it was, and sort of the middle of the year, the FDA held a public meeting, and the public meeting was around eligibility criteria as it pertains to a clinical trial, and how broadening diversity of the trial population that you enroll in your clinical trial will end up with a better, more robust data set. And then sort of fast forward a year, so this was like June 2019, they actually published a set of guidelines. So if anyone is interested or is running clinical trials on the call, I really recommend you download a copy of those guidelines. They are very helpful in terms of how we design trials to address that very question of, is the data representative of the broader population in which this will be useful and utilized in the future?
So first of all, that was fascinating. But what went through my mind as you were describing all of that is the massive amount of data that is being collected as a result of populations, subpopulations, age groups, and all of this. What are your thoughts around the capabilities and how all that data is going to be analyzed quickly, effectively to come to the kinds of conclusions that you were talking about?
So, the companies that are leading the charge, if you will, in terms of the phase 3 clinical trials, these are very well-established global companies with fantastic track records bringing products to market. And they know how to run clinical trials. They know how to collect data. So first of all, it's about data collection, making sure that that data that you are collecting is good quality data, robust data, accurate data, and then how you store it and mine it. So don't forget, a lot of these trials are blind, meaning that when you enroll in the trial, you don't know which arm you're randomized in. So at the end of the trial, you sort of call stop, you sort of lock the database. And then, when you unblind, then you can make comparisons around, well, what happened in this cohort versus that cohort. And this is also when you get to slice and dice the data. So I want to see, I don't know, what was the response in men versus women? What was the response in people 45 to 60 years of age versus 20 to 30 years of age? And so they have teams of biostatisticians and clinicians and scientists who will be sitting around analyzing, asking the questions, knowing what questions to ask, and then working with agencies like the FDA around that. And then obviously all of this goes into the data set, because that speaks to efficacy and safety and the population and how to utilize the vaccine. And that will also help us in terms of that question around if and hopefully when we see more than one vaccine, given that EUA, then is there a difference? Is there the ability to say, you know what, Marty, I think you are better suited to this vaccine, and Karen, I think you are better suited to that vaccine, and here's why. And supporting that, and then educating clinicians and the physicians who are going to be having those discussions. So for example, if you find individuals with underlying disease, is there a vaccine or a dose or something that is better for them than another option? So I think these are all very important questions that will be asked. I think that the initial safety and efficacy will be what's first pulled together, discussions with the agency. But I also see that as more and more data comes on, and as we talked about earlier, this is not a line in the sand, I've got my EUA and I'm all done. Those trials will continue. And it brings up really good ethical questions around that as well. Okay, so I've now enrolled in a clinical trial. I don't know if I'm in the placebo arm or the vaccine arm, and another company now have their trial under EUA. Do I jump out of this trial? Do I go and get that vaccine? Can I get that vaccine when I don't know what I was given in the first place? Does that impact the way that trial data is going to end up? There's lots of interesting questions around how we're going to manage through this, much less how you actually distribute the vaccine, how you actually track people. So, again, Marty goes and gets his first dose and he turns up and he went to the CVS down the road. And then he turns up for his second, because he's like, oh, don't I have a second dose at some point? And then you're like, I don't really know which one I got. And was it 28 days or was it 21 days? So you can see sort of the logistics around this are going to be phenomenal. And, there's certainly different pathways for those logistics as well. Those vaccines that were working closely with the government and involved in government funding, and therefore are part of the government's perspective around how do we distribute this and what is a plan that is going to give us equitability, and also sort of looking at the distribution by impacting those people who is disproportionately impacted, who does have underlying disease, who is an essential worker, and making sure they're in a higher tier. And then organizations like Pfizer, who not only have the distribution question, they also have the cold chain question, because their vaccine has to be kept at very, very ultra cold temperatures, much like Moderna's, because theirs is an mRNA. Both of them have an mRNA vaccine, and those vaccines have to be kept very cold. And so how do I manage that? When I'm thinking about a global distribution, the logistics are truly phenomenal in order to roll that out. So lots of pieces to the puzzle here.
I've said from the beginning of this, when this is behind us, there are going to be a lot of heroes that deserve our gratitude. And I think we lose sight not only of how many people are involved in these vaccine studies and the development, but the the different professions that are involved in managing all of this, the analytics, the logistics, and all of these pieces. So kind of along the lines of what you were discussing, there is one question that's come up that I think is pertinent to ask at this point, and that is, you talk about post-marketing studies and managing, monitoring adverse reactions. What does that look like in I guess what does it mean?
So the trials, the phase 3 trials that are ongoing now, they'll do a data cut in order to get the EUA, but the trial will continue because the trial does not end at that point in time. So when I say post, it's really post EUA because they still have to do a regular submission to the FDA. So they'll still need the full data set in order to do that. And then a number of companies or companies, once you actually have something, have that approval, you have a requirement and a responsibility to continue to track, to monitor. We as clinicians, as scientists, as pharmaceutical and biotech companies, we have a duty to continue to maintain the safety of individuals and the safety of patients. And so we keep and we track what's happening, what adverse events are happening. Is there a flag? Is there a signal? Am I seeing an uptick in some sort of an adverse event? Is that something we need to really look into further? And you saw this too in the clinical trials that are ongoing at the moment. We've had 3 now who have called a pause, and AstraZeneca, J&J, and then Lilly with their therapeutic. And they said, all right, we saw a safety signal. This is what is supposed to happen. This is not unusual in a clinical trial. When you have 30,000 people, 60,000 people in a clinical trial, then it's not unusual to see an adverse event, and the system is working because the system said, we need to tap pause. We need to understand what's happening here. That's exactly what happened. They bring in the Data Safety Monitoring Board, the DSMB. They will unblind to find out, was that individual on placebo or were they on drug? What's going on? What's the situation? You also have to be mindful of HIPAA and patient confidentiality and so on. And then making a decision: do we feel comfortable to continue with the trial, which is what has happened, or is there something else that we need to either further understand or bring together more data on, or do more testing on, or in a worst case scenario, you say, okay, the FDA is going to step in now and say we're stopping the trial. So, I think the message there is that with what you're seeing playing out in the news is what would normally happen in a clinical trial with the systems and processes and checks and balances that we have. It just doesn't normally play out on the front page of the New York Times. So I think that's the difference here, is that we're seeing all of that, and people will continue to monitor. So I think as more people take the vaccine, you will see more data come in. And again, all of this helps. So it's an iterative process, and we will continue to analyze the data, assess the data, watch the safety events, track, monitor, slice and dice to determine where is this going to be most effective. Are there any concerns that we have? And this will continue as long as the vaccine or drug or therapeutic is on market.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Smith, we have a number of questions, but before we get to them, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you'd like to touch on before we go to the Q&A?
I would like to give a little bit of a shout out to the company, to Emergent. We have 19 global locations, but we do call Maryland home, as you know, and our headquarters are in Gaithersburg. And that's where our product development site is, and where the majority of the COVID response work is also located. We have 2 manufacturing facilities in Baltimore, and they're in Bayview and Camden, as well as in Rockville. And across those 5 Maryland locations, we have over 800 people. So we are growing and hiring at an incredibly rapid rate. And we quite literally have hundreds of long-term great job opportunities. So if you want to be part of a noble mission, of a great purpose and a great company, then I would really encourage folks to join the fight against COVID-19 and many other public health threats. And I just wanted to put in a plug for the team, because I know that they are recruiting and building and growing, and it's a super exciting time. And so if anyone is interested, please, please come and join us.
No, and I will add to that. Emergent is an amazing company. It is a noble cause. It's a noble company. What Emergent has accomplished even before the pandemic has been phenomenal. And so I would echo that. If anyone's looking for that type of a work environment, that type of a workplace, and wants to be a part of such a noble cause, I would highly encourage you to talk to Emergent. So. Looking at the questions here, first of all, I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, please put it either in the Q&A or in the chat room, and we will get to everyone that we can. Just also an additional reminder, Dr. Smith can't talk about anything specifically related to their clients' products or their products. There was one question here about a comparison between the vaccines that I don't think we will get to that one as a result. But so there is a question, and I think this goes to, talking about the heroes and how people feel about what they're doing. But the question is, with all the talk, with the politicization of the vaccine development, and all the talk and about half the population saying that they wouldn't take it, does this have an effect on your teams, the team's morale overall?
No, I don't think it has an effect on the morale of the team, because the team is so committed to wanting to create and be part of the solution. And part of that solution involves education and awareness. And so we have to make these therapeutics, we have to make these vaccines, and we have to address the scientific and clinical questions at hand, for sure. But I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that how we educate minority groups and disproportionately impacted individuals and groups, how we think about distribution and access. It's not just about educating people on the value, if you will, of getting a vaccine. It's about how do you make it so it's accessible for somebody who may not be down the road from a CVS or wherever it's going to be distributed through, or some sort of distribution place or site. So I think when I think about the individuals at Emergent, they are super motivated, super driven, and they truly are working around the clock. So our manufacturing teams have 24/7 work along with our scientists and many others in order to push us forward. So again, in a normal situation, would you see people working 24/7 for any other drug development that perhaps didn't have the time horizon and the time pressure that COVID brings with it? Again, all of these things speak to how you've managed to shorten and condense that timeline. But it's a great question in terms of, does this impact people? I think I see it as an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity to educate people on science, to educate people on clinical trials and what the biopharmaceutical industry does, and how we contribute to medicine and patient care, and how we really do put patient safety first, and how we enhance and help life, and how that's really important to us, and how we consider diversity and inclusion and equity in the treatments and therapies that we make. So I like to think of it as a wonderful opportunity, and I like to think that the people I work alongside every day think likewise.
So because of my role at the Tech Council, I've had the opportunity to visit some of the companies that are developing the vaccines, Novavax, for instance. And I can tell everyone who's listening right now that these employees at Emergent, at Novavax, at Altimmune, at all these companies are so extraordinarily mission driven right now that they are literally working 24/7. And giving up their weekends, giving up their family time in order to get this mission accomplished. And so I think that passion and that drive, it just keeps them going. I don't see them getting disillusioned or by what's happening publicly in the media, if you will. They're just so mission driven and mission oriented. So Dr. Smith, Emergent BioSolutions has been a part of a tremendous collaboration right here in Maryland. When the pandemic hit, we saw over 40 companies just immediately pivot and focus on the response to the pandemic, not knowing whether the government was going to be able to put up any additional funding. They were spending their own money. They knew this was a mission that they had to become involved in. You mentioned competitors working with one another. We saw diagnostics laboratories opening up their laboratories so competing developers could come in and develop their technologies in the same laboratory that they were developing. And so the amount of collaboration and cooperation has been like nothing I've ever seen before. It's been amazing. Can you comment? I know you commented on that some. Can you comment on that a bit more? What are your thoughts around that collaboration? How's it gone specifically, especially here in Maryland? And what else could we do, if anything?
I think the government have played a really wonderful facilitative role here. And first of all, they stepped up, and the US federal government have invested over $12 billion, and other governments around the world, Europe, Asia, Africa, ex-US NGOs, an additional $8 billion. So all told, it's over $20 billion that, and they didn't segregate it out. They sort of said, this is how together we need to combat this. And so I think that from a partnership perspective and a collaboration perspective, they have helped to bring the different bodies and groups together, because it's not just about the companies that, or the innovators or the sponsors. It's not just about the government. I mean, this is about communities. This is about organizations such as the council. This is about everybody really pulling together and trying to address the many moving parts in this 3D puzzle that we're trying to put together, and different people having different pieces of that. So, I think when you talk about collaboration, I think it's very easy to narrow that down to 2 or 3 different groups. But I think the reality is that the only way we've managed to move at the speed we have to accelerate is by actually bringing everybody into the discussion and to hearing the different voices, but being able for people to compromise. I mean, I think that's been phenomenal, whether it's 2 companies or company and government or the CDMO or Emergent or whoever it is. We've really come together, and that shared mission. They say that people work together in a company under a shared mission, and that's the glue that holds us together. And the shared mission here has been COVID. And I think everybody has really identified very quickly with that. And that's the glue that's helped us move forward. We've seen it in the past, the flu pandemic, the turn of the century and so on, that actually did the same thing. We've seen various pandemics over the years where people have come together with that shared mission. And I feel like that's what we're seeing here. I'd like to think it continues afterwards.
Yeah, no, me too. I think, first of all, I think here in Maryland, people ask me, I'm originally from Southern California, so not quite as far away as Australia, but far away. And people ask me why. And one of the reasons is because of that collaborative nature that I see here that I haven't seen in other parts of the country as I've come up through the ranks in biotechnology. So we have a question here. I'm going to paraphrase this one a little bit, and I suspect that this might be a question that could take an entire podcast of its own. And that is, with the clinical trials, specifically the ones that have been halted temporarily because of adverse events, have there been any specific insights or lessons learned from these trials that you can think of?
So I think this is what I was touching on in terms of when you run a clinical trial, there are many checks and balances in place in order to ensure the safety of the participants in that trial. And one of them is that when an adverse event happens, which is, and there are different types of adverse events. So there's the adverse event as in I came in, I got my injection, whatever it is, placebo or otherwise, and the next day I had a headache and I had aches and pains and I didn't feel so good. They're all logged as adverse events. And so they're written down, they're documented, how long did your headache last, how severe was it, and so on. So as you can imagine, there are those that you expect to see in this type of a trial, like I would expect to see those types of adverse events in individuals. And then there are adverse events that you think, oh, that wasn't what I was expecting to see. And that's a time when the company and the agency and others will go, okay, this is where we just need to pause and understand what's happening here. So if you take the case of the AstraZeneca one. So AstraZeneca called a pause and they said, okay, we have an event with an individual subject, and we need to understand what's going on here. In accordance with what has been in the news, certainly the speculation is that it was a case of transverse myelitis, that's an inflammation of the spine. It's a very rare event. And so then you have to sort of sit down statistically and say, what would be the probability of somebody getting a rare disease who also just happens to be an individual who happens to be in this particular clinical trial? Are those events related? Do they correlate or not? Was this, something that I should be concerned about, or was this just serendipity, and this is just one of those instances? So understanding that is sort of the first piece, and so you start to have a dialogue around, what are the probabilities? Do I think, knowing what I know about the science, knowing what I know about the mode of action of the vaccine, knowing what I know about the vector that they use? I mean, there's AstraZeneca's as a viral vector approach, because all of these vaccines have slightly different approaches. Is it a protein? Is it an mRNA? Is it a viral vector? Have I seen that in any other viral vectors? Theirs was a platform that had been used before. Did I see it when they used it to make Ebola virus and other things that have been certainly through FDA approval? So we have a good cohort of safety data already. So these are all the different data points that go into the discussion. And that discussion will be had with the agencies, that discussion will be had with the clinicians, that discussion will be had with the actual physician who's treating that patient. It will also be had with the physicians who oversee the clinical trial, and also the DSMB, that Data Safety Monitoring Board, that is a group of individual experts who will weigh in on these sorts of things. In the case of AZ, the EMA said, we're okay, keep going. And the US said, you know what, we just want to hold off a bit more. And as of this week, they've said that they're going to restart the AZ one. In the case of J&J, theirs was more recent. And they actually have said, at this point in time, this is a very recent occurrence. We just want to understand a little bit more about what's happening. And they have chosen not to disclose any information around the individual or that case as it stands at the moment. And so I'm sure we will hear more over time as decisions are made around that. But that's those two cases. And then the Lilly one was against a treatment. So I think the takeaway message for me is that patient safety is always first. And the checks and balances in place to provide that degree of safety and oversight are there, and the system was working. The system worked because we hit pause, we understood, we collected the data and made a decision. And as I said, the AZ one has now started to re-enroll again.
Cool. So we have a question about an emergency use authorization. So how long does an EUA remain in effect? And are there specific milestones that the company needs to meet during that post EUA follow-up?
So usually an EUA is exactly like the title says. It's an emergency use authorization. It's authorization to use this in an emergency situation like we're in with COVID. It's not designed to be a forever. It's designed to enable you to start to utilize this therapy because you have enough data to provide a degree of safety and efficacy data for the agency to have them feel comfortable that what is being rolled out is going to be effective in a population and also not put people at undue risk. So that's how you get that first authorization. But the idea is that you continue to run your phase 3 clinical trial. You continue to collect data. You continue to reach data points and data sets that are large enough to give us the comfort level and the robustness of data and the quality of data that we can put into a regulatory submission that you then put forward for a full approval and a full label. So the idea is that you don't sit on this forever. It's that exactly like the title says, it's for emergency use. And ultimately you would like an FDA approval and a label approval like you would traditionally go through for a normal drug that you have in development.
Great. So Dr. Smith, we're coming up to the end of our time. And I know I asked you this before we got into the Q&A, but given the questions that you've heard, is there anything that you'd like to add before we conclude today?
It's been a pleasure, and I love the fact that there are organizations like the council that are bringing people together, that are having these conversations. I think that these conversations are critical. As I said, it takes a country, it takes a village, it takes a community, it takes not just the scientists and the clinicians are the people that we see on television at night, but it is going to take all of us educating, awareness, being aware ourselves, being part of the solution to actually move that clock that you mentioned at the beginning around to a point where we can return to whatever the pre-pandemic world was going to look like. And I think we all think that it will be perhaps different to what it was, but certainly a place that we would like to transition to. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to people, to engage with people, to answer questions. I am happy to do that anytime, because I truly believe in the power of education and knowledge, and having that knowledge and understanding is really going to help us to move the needle forward.
Great, that's great. So I want to apologize to those that asked questions that we didn't get to. There was one question specifically about how the vaccine will be distributed. And I want to point out that there was a press release earlier this week from the governor about Maryland's plan for distribution of a vaccine. So I would encourage you to go look at that press release. You can actually download the entire plan. I will also tell you, though, that a lot of that is being driven by the US government and the CDC. And so, there may be gaps in the plan that you'll have questions about, but that's because the CDC and the US government is driving so much of that. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for your time today. Everybody that tuned in to listen, again, thank you for your time. I think this has been a great conversation. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Alexandria Real Estate and Pfizer. And Dr. Smith, you're doing great work. Emergent BioSolutions is a phenomenal company, and keep it up. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you to all the listeners as well.